By 1941, the German Wehrmacht was the master of continental Europe. They had kicked the British Army off the continent at Dunkirk. They had crushed France in 6 weeks. To the German High Command, the war on land was effectively won. Britain was just a stubborn island, besieged by U-boats and bombed by the Luftwaffe. The German attitude toward the British military was one of dismissal. They respected the Royal Navy. They respected the RAF fighter pilots who had won the Battle of Britain. But they had utter contempt for the British Army's ability to strike back on land. German officers sitting in occupied Paris or Berlin joked about British amateurism. They saw the British Army as an outdated colonial police force, incapable of modern, mechanized warfare. They believed that Fortress Europe was impregnable from the sea. Along the Atlantic coast of France, they began to build defenses. Bunkers, gun batteries, radar stations. But these defenses were not built with a sense of urgency. They were built with a sense of arrogant security. The Germans firmly believed that no large-scale invasion could happen for years. And small-scale raids? They dismissed them as pinpricks. Occasionally, small groups of British soldiers would land on a beach at night, shoot up a radar post, grab a prisoner, and leave. The German generals saw these as nuisance raids. Mosquito bites on the hide of an elephant. They were annoying, but strategically meaningless. They believed the British lacked the aggression, the training, and the sheer nerve to attempt anything larger. They were wrong. They didn't realize that the British, backed into a corner, were about to invent a new kind of warfare. A warfare defined not by mass divisions, but by surgical violence. Winston Churchill refused to sit on the defensive. After Dunkirk, the British Army was shattered. They had lost almost all their heavy equipment. They were years away from being able to launch a D-Day-style invasion. But Churchill knew that for morale, both at home and in occupied Europe, Britain had to be seen to be fighting back. He didn't just want to defend the island, he wanted to attack the coast. In June 1940, just days after the fall of France, he issued a directive. He called for the creation of a new force. A force of hunter-class soldiers. Their mission was simple and brutal: set Europe ablaze. He wanted troops who could land silently on occupied coasts, destroy vital infrastructure, kill the enemy, and vanish before dawn. He called it butcher and bolt warfare. This was the birth of the Commandos. They were volunteers from across the British Army. They were looking for men who were bored with regular drill, men who wanted a fight. The training was grueling. They trained in the rugged Scottish Highlands. They learned to kill with knives. They learned to handle explosives. They learned amphibious landings in freezing water. They were not gentlemen officers. They were trained to be gangsters. At first, the German assessment seemed correct. The early commando raids were small and often ineffective. Equipment failed. Navigation went wrong. They were indeed pinpricks. But the Commandos were learning. They were refining their tactics. They were developing specialized equipment. And in London, the planners were looking at the map, looking for a target that would hurt the Germans where they least expected it. They found a target that was so heavily defended, so strategically vital, that attacking it seemed like suicide. It was the perfect mission for the Commandos. The Battle of the Atlantic was the lifeline of Britain. If the German U-boats and surface raiders cut off the supply ships from America, Britain would starve. In 1941, the German Navy had a weapon that terrified the British Admiralty: the battleship Tirpitz. It was the sister ship to the infamous Bismarck. It was massive, heavily armored, and armed with huge 15-inch guns. It was currently hiding in the fjords of Norway, a fleet in being, tying down British resources just by existing. If the Tirpitz broke out into the Atlantic, it could devastate the Allied convoys. But the Tirpitz had an Achilles heel. It was enormous. If it sailed into the Atlantic and got into a fight, if it took damage below the waterline, it would need a dry dock for repairs. There was only one dry dock on the entire Atlantic coast of occupied Europe big enough to hold the Tirpitz: the fameux Louis Hubert in the French port of Saint-Nazaire. It was built in the 1930s for the giant ocean liner Normandie. It was a massive concrete bathtub, over 1,000 feet long. It was protected by huge, hollow steel caisson gates that rolled into place. To the British strategic planners, the equation was simple. If they destroyed the Saint-Nazaire dock, the Tirpitz would have nowhere to go for repairs in the Atlantic. Without a repair base, the Germans would be terrified to risk their precious battleship in the open ocean. Destroying the dock would neutralize the Tirpitz threat without ever having to sink the ship. But Saint-Nazaire was a fortress. It was miles up the Loire River estuary. The banks of the river were lined with dozens of German coastal artillery batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and searchlights. The port itself was swarming with German troops. To attack it with a conventional naval force would be suicidal. The ships would be blown out of the water before they got halfway up the river. To bomb it from the air was impossible. The targets, the sliding lock gates and the pumping machinery, were too small and too heavily protected for inaccurate high-altitude bombing. There was only one way to destroy it: a direct assault from the sea, right under the noses of the German guns. It was a mission that required insanity or absolute desperation. The British had both. The plan for Operation Chariot was breathtaking in its audacity. It read like something out of a pulp fiction novel. The British realized they couldn't destroy the massive concrete dock structure itself. But they could destroy the giant steel gate that kept the water out. If they broke the gate, the dock would be useless. But how do you break a steel gate that is 167 feet long, 54 feet high, and 35 feet thick? You need a very big hammer. The British Admiralty came up with a solution: the Trojan horse. They took an old, obsolete destroyer. It was an American four-stacker from World War I, given to the British under Lend-Lease. It was named HMS Campbelltown. They took this old ship to a dockyard and began a bizarre transformation. They stripped out all the non-essential gear to make it lighter, so it could sail over the shallow sandbanks of the Loire estuary. They cut down its funnels to make it look, from a distance, like a German torpedo boat. Then, they turned it into a massive, floating bomb. Below decks, in the bow of the ship, they encased 24 depth charges in concrete. That was 4.5 tons of high explosive. The plan was simple and terrifying. A small flotilla of wooden motor launches, carrying the Commandos, would escort the Campbelltown up the river at night. They would bluff their way past the German defenses using captured German signals. Once they reached the port, the Campbelltown would accelerate to full speed. It would ram directly into the main dock gate. The commandos would jump off the ship and the motor launches. Their job was to run amok in the dockyard, blowing up the pumping stations and winding mechanisms that operated the gates. While the chaos was unfolding, the crew of the Campbelltown would trigger delayed action fuses on the 4 tons of explosives buried in the bow. The fuses were set to detonate hours later, long after the raiders had, hopefully, withdrawn. It was a suicide mission in all but name. The planners knew that the wooden motor launches, filled with gasoline, would be death traps once the German guns opened fire. They estimated that getting back home was a long shot. When the plan was presented to the commando leaders, they didn't flinch. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, who would lead the commandos ashore, told his men, "As I see it, we are just about to perform the most important and difficult task any soldiers have ever been asked to perform." The German officers in St. Nazaire slept soundly in their bunkers. They knew the British were annoying. They knew they might try a small raid on a beach somewhere. But they could not conceive that the British would take an explosive-laden destroyer and drive it straight down the throat of one of the most heavily defended ports in Europe. Their arrogance was about to be their undoing. March 28, 1942. 1 a.m. The mouth of the Loire River was pitch black. Entering this darkness was a strange, ragtag flotilla. In the center loomed the HMS Campbelltown, the old 4-stack destroyer, now disguised to look like a German Mo-class torpedo boat. Flanking her were 16 small motor launches, MLS. These were not warships. They were essentially wooden pleasure craft, unarmored, filled with extra fuel tanks on the deck to give them the range to reach France. They were floating petrol bombs. Inside these fragile wooden boats sat the commandos. They were armed with Thompson submachine guns, Bren guns, and massive backpacks filled with explosives. The plan relied on stealth. If the Germans spotted them early, the shore batteries, heavy 75mm and 150mm guns, would blow the wooden boats out of the water in seconds. The flotilla crept forward. They didn't take the main deep water channel, which was heavily guarded. Instead, they took a risk. They sailed over the mudflats at high tide. It was a terrifying navigational challenge. If they touched the bottom, they would be stranded under the German guns until dawn. But the tide held. They scraped over the mud, bypassing the outer defenses. Then, the lights came on. A German searchlight from the north bank swept the water. It caught the Campbelltown in its beam. Then another light. And another. The river was suddenly illuminated by a blinding white glare. The German sentries were alert. They had heard the engines. A signal lamp blinked from the shore. A challenge. Identify yourself. This was the moment of truth. On the bridge of the Campbelltown, a British signalman, who had learned the specific German challenge codes for that night, signaled back. He flashed the call sign of a German torpedo boat known to be operating in the area. Then, he added a stroke of genius. He signaled, "Wait. Emergency. Have damaged engines." He fired a Verrier flare, the specific color used by the Germans that night. The bluff bought them time. The German gunners hesitated. They saw a ship that looked German. It was signaling the right codes. It claimed to be in distress. The guns remained silent. The flotilla kept moving. They were now just 2 miles from the dock gate. 1 mile. The tension on the boats was unbearable. Men gripped their weapons, staring into the blinding lights, waiting for the inevitable. Then, the bluff collapsed. The German radar operators realized that the flotilla was too large to be a single damaged torpedo boat. The order was given. Open fire. The river erupted. Dozens of German guns, 20 mm flak, 37 mm cannons, heavy coastal artillery, opened up simultaneously from both banks. The silence of the night was shattered by a wall of noise and light. Tracers crisscrossed the river like a net of fire. The wooden motor launches began to disintegrate. Bullets ripped through the thin hulls, igniting the fuel tanks. But in the center of the firestorm, the HMS Campbelltown did not stop. She lowered the German flag and hoisted the white ensign of the Royal Navy. The time for stealth was over. Commander Beatty, on the bridge, ordered full speed ahead. The old destroyer shuddered as the engines were pushed to the red line. She was sailing into a hurricane of steel, and her target was dead ahead. The last mile of the approach to Saint-Nazaire was a scene from hell. The HMS Campbelltown was drawing fire from every gun in the harbor. She was being hit repeatedly. Chunks of the superstructure were flying off. The bridge was riddled with shrapnel. Men were falling on the deck. But the ship had a charmed life. The vital components, the engines and the steering gear, were protected by extra armor plating installed back in England. She kept moving. She was accelerating. 15 knots. 18 knots. 20 knots. The German gunners on the dockside realized with horror what the ship was doing. They depressed their guns, firing point-blank into the destroyer's bow. But a destroyer is a massive projectile. At 20 knots, it has unstoppable momentum. On the bridge, Commander Beatty stood calm amidst the chaos. His coxswain was killed at the wheel. Another man stepped in and took it. Beatty peered through the smoke. The massive steel caisson of the Normandy dock loomed out of the darkness. It was the biggest door in the world. And he was going to kick it in. Stand by for impact. At 1:34 a.m., 4 minutes later than planned, the Campbelltown struck. Crunch! The sound was sickening and magnificent. The sharp steel bow of the destroyer sliced through the anti-torpedo nets like spiderwebs. It slammed into the center of the caisson gate. 35 feet of the ship's bow crumpled like an accordion. The ship drove itself 33 feet onto the gate, wedging itself tight. The impact was so violent that everyone on board was thrown to the deck. The German gun positions on the dock were silenced by the sheer shock of the collision. For a second, there was silence. Then, the Campbelltown's guns opened up. The British sailors manning the Oerlikon cannons on the upper deck began suppressing the German searchlights and pillboxes. The ship had done its job. It had delivered the payload. 4.5 tons of Amatol high explosive, encased in concrete deep inside the crumpled steel of the bow, was now sitting directly on top of the dock gate. The fuses were ticking. The German defenders, rallying from their shock, poured fire onto the stationary ship. But the commandos were already moving. Lines were thrown over the side. Ladders were dropped. Commandos! Ashore! The men of the landing parties, carrying 60-pound rucksacks of explosives, scrambled down the sides of the ship and onto the top of the caisson gate. They were running directly into the teeth of the German defenses. They had arrived. The Trojan horse had entered the city. But now the soldiers inside had to fight their way out. As the commandos sprinted off the deck of the Campbell town and onto the dockside, they entered a chaotic, close-quarters firefight. Their orders were specific: destroy the infrastructure that makes the dock work. There were two main targets, the pumping house and the winding house. These buildings housed the massive machinery that pumped water in and out of the dry dock and the motors that moved the giant gates. Without them, even if the gate was repaired, the dock would be useless. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, commanding the ground forces, established his headquarters in an old building nearby. He stood in the open, directing his men, ignoring the tracer fire buzzing around him. The demolition teams were the tip of the spear. Groups of 5 men, protecting 1 man carrying the charges. They fought their way through the German sentries. The Germans were confused. They were used to fighting regular soldiers. They weren't used to men in wool caps and sneakers. Some commandos wore rubber-soled shoes for silence, who moved fast and fired from the hip with Tommy guns. The demolition teams reached the pump house. They blew the doors off. They ran inside, placed charges on the massive impeller pumps, set the timers, and ran out. Boom! The pump house collapsed. The machinery fell into the void below. They reached the winding house. Boom! The winding mechanisms were shattered. Within 30 minutes, the Street Nazaire dock was crippled. But out on the river, the tragedy was unfolding. The wooden motor launches that were supposed to land the rest of the commandos and then evacuate everyone were being slaughtered. They were catching fire one by one. The river was a sheet of flame. Many launches exploded before they could even touch the dock. The men inside burned or drowned. Only a few launches managed to land their troops. Colonel Newman realized that the extraction plan had failed. The boats were gone. There was no ride home. He gathered the survivors, about 100 men, in the ruins of the old town. They were surrounded. They were running out of ammo. He looked at them and gave one of the most legendary orders in British military history. "Well, chaps, we've missed the boat. We'll have to walk home." Walking home meant fighting their way through the entire German garrison, escaping the city, and trekking 400 miles through occupied France to Spain. It was impossible. But they tried. They charged into the town of Saint Nazaire. They fought house to house. They fought through the streets. They caused so much chaos that the Germans thought they were facing a full-scale invasion. Eventually, the ammunition ran out. Most of the commandos were killed or captured. Only 5 men managed to escape all the way back to England. By dawn, the fighting had died down. The Germans had regained control of the port. They were rounding up the prisoners. German officers walked among the carnage, looking at the wreckage. They felt a sense of relief. They had repelled the raid. They looked at the Campbell town wedged in the gate. They thought it was just a failed ramming attempt. A desperate, clumsy British failure. They didn't know about the ticking sound deep inside the ship's hull. The morning of March 29, 1942, broke cool and clear over Saint Nazaire. The battle was over. The Germans were busy securing the area. They were triumphant. They had captured hundreds of British commandos. They had sunk almost the entire flotilla. The dock was damaged, yes, but the gate seemed intact. The British destroyer was just stuck there, a trophy of the German victory. A festive atmosphere developed on the docks. German soldiers, sailors, and even some French civilians gathered to look at the wreckage of the HMS Campbelltown. Hundreds of German sightseers climbed aboard the ship. They took photographs on the deck. They inspected the guns. They marveled at the commando equipment left behind. German engineering officers climbed down into the hull to inspect the damage. They wanted to figure out how to tow the ship away. They walked right past the concrete casing that held the 4 tons of explosives. They didn't notice it. Meanwhile, the captured British officers, including Commander Beatty, were being interrogated by a German intelligence officer nearby. The German officer was smug. "It is a pity," he said to Beatty. "You British people are so foolish. You damaged the dock machinery, yes. But the gate is solid. You did not destroy it." Beatty looked at his watch. It was nearing noon. The acid fuses on the explosives were timed to dissolve a copper wire, releasing the firing pin. Acid fuses are notoriously inaccurate. They can be hours early or hours late depending on the temperature. Beatty said nothing. He just waited. 10 a.m. passed. 11 a.m. passed. The crowd on the ship grew larger. A senior German officer was holding a briefing on the quarterdeck. Then, at 10:35 a.m., the world turned white. The 4.5 tons of Amatil detonated. The explosion was cataclysmic. It vaporized the entire front half of the Campbelltown. It instantly killed the hundreds of German soldiers and souvenir hunters on board. It blew the massive steel caisson gate off its tracks and hurled it into the dry dock. A tidal wave of water from the estuary rushed into the dry dock, sweeping everything before it, including 2 German tankers that were inside for repairs. The shockwave shattered windows across the town of Saint-Nazaire. Panic ensued. The Germans, already on edge from the night's fighting, thought the British were attacking again. German soldiers began firing wildly at French workers, thinking they were saboteurs. Chaos reigned for hours. When the smoke finally cleared, the scale of the destruction was visible. The Normandy dock, the only home for the Tirpitz on the Atlantic coast, was gone. The gate was destroyed. The machinery was wrecked. The German High Command was stunned. They had celebrated a victory at breakfast, and by lunch, they had suffered a strategic disaster. The British commandos had sacrificed themselves, but they had won. The Tirpitz would never sail into the Atlantic. It would spend the rest of the war hiding in Norway, paralyzed by the knowledge that it had nowhere to go for repairs. The raid was not a pinprick. It was a dagger to the heart of the German naval strategy. And it proved that Fortress Europe was not impregnable. If a handful of men in an old destroyer could do this, what could a real invasion force do? The laughter of the German officers had been silenced by the roar of the Campbelltown. The detonation of the HMS Campbelltown was not the end of the nightmare for the German garrison at Saint-Nazaire. It was just the opening note of a symphony of chaos that would last for days. The immediate aftermath of the main explosion was horrific. The dry dock was destroyed. The Tirpitz threat was neutralized. But the Germans didn't know that was the only big bomb. Panic spread through the ranks. The German soldiers, usually disciplined, began to see ghosts. They had found British commandos hiding in the town. They had seen the massive destruction caused by the ship. They became convinced that the British had planted explosives everywhere. Strategic paranoia set in. Then, just when the German commanders were beginning to restore order, the second phase of the British plan kicked in. During the raid, the small motor launches had fired special delayed action torpedoes into the lock gates of the old entrance, the secondary access point to the basin. These torpedoes were fitted with long delay fuses. On Monday, March 30th, more than 24 hours after the raid had ended, the first torpedo exploded. Boom! A massive column of water and debris shot into the sky. The German garrison panicked again. They thought the British submarines were in the harbor. Or worse, they thought the British agents were still in the city. An hour later, another torpedo exploded. The psychological impact was devastating. The German soldiers began shooting at shadows. They opened fire on French dock workers, believing they were saboteurs detonating charges. In the confusion, German units actually fired on each other. Hundreds of French civilians were killed in the crossfire as the Germans lost control of the city. The panic traveled all the way up the chain of command to Berlin. Hitler and the High Command were receiving frantic reports from Street Nazaire. First, they heard the raid was repelled. Then, they heard the dry dock was destroyed. Now, they were hearing about mysterious explosions continuing for days. It seemed like the British could strike at will, leave, and still inflict damage days later. The illusion of security was shattered. The Street Nazaire raid proved that the Atlantic Wall was a fantasy. It showed that no matter how many guns you put on the coast, a determined force could punch through. The explosion didn't just destroy a dock, it destroyed the German confidence in their own defenses. The shockwave was felt not just in the physical destruction of the port, but in the corridors of power in the Third Reich. The British were not the amateurs the Germans had laughed at. They were capable of a level of deception and violence that the Germans had completely underestimated. The Campbell town was gone, but the fear it planted would grow like a cancer in the German strategic mindset. When Adolf Hitler received the full report on St. Nazaire, his reaction was not rational analysis. It was blinding rage. Hitler prided himself on military intuition. He viewed the British commandos not as soldiers, but as terrorists. He was furious that a handful of gangsters could humiliate the German navy and army. He looked at the tactics used, the disguise of the ship, the civilian clothes worn by some agents, though the commandos wore uniforms, the stealth, the sabotage. To his twisted mind, this was unfair warfare. It was contrary to the chivalrous traditions of the Prussian officer corps, traditions he selectively ignored when it suited him. He ranted to his generals that the British were waging a Jewish warfare, his catch-all term for anything he despised. This rage crystallized into one of the most infamous documents of the war, the Kommandobefehl, the Commando Order. Issued in October 1942, largely as a result of the St. Nazaire raid and subsequent raids like Dieppe, it changed the rules of war. The order stated that any Allied commando or saboteur captured by German forces, even if they were in full uniform and surrendering, was to be slaughtered to the last man. They were to be handed over to the SS and executed immediately without trial. This was a war crime. It violated the Geneva Convention explicitly. Hitler justified it by claiming the Commandos were acting outside the laws of war. He hoped that this brutality would terrify the British soldiers and stop the raids. He believed that if the British knew that capture meant death, they would refuse to volunteer. He was wrong. The commando order had the opposite effect. When the British soldiers learned about the order, it didn't make them timid. It made them ferocious. They knew that surrender was not an option. They fought to the death because they had no choice. It also hardened the resolve of the Allied leadership. The Street-Nazaire raid had embarrassed Hitler personally. He had declared Fortress Europe impenetrable. The Commandos had driven a destroyer through his front door. His ego couldn't take it. The commando order was the lashing out of a dictator who realized he was losing control of the battlefield. He could command armies, but he couldn't stop 5 men with dynamite. And that terrified him. The strategic legacy of Saint-Nazaire went far beyond the destruction of a dry dock. It caused a massive diversion of German resources that arguably helped the Allies win the war. After the raid, Hitler became obsessed with the security of the Atlantic coast. He became paranoid that the British would launch an invasion at any moment. He ordered a massive acceleration of the Atlantic Wall construction program. Thousands of tons of concrete, steel, and labor were poured into fortifying the French coast. Massive bunkers were built to protect U-boat pens. Huge gun batteries were installed. But here is the crucial point: every ton of concrete poured in France was a ton of concrete not used in Russia. Every anti-tank gun installed on a beach in Normandy was a gun not fighting the T-34s at Kursk. Every division of soldiers stationed to guard the French ports was a division not fighting on the Eastern Front. The Street-Nazaire raid forced Hitler to keep hundreds of thousands of his best troops in the West, guarding against a threat that wouldn't materialize fully until 1944. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and later Rommel were tasked with defending the coast. They spent years and billions of Reichsmarks building static defenses. The raid had spooked them. They realized that ports were the key. The British strategy relied on capturing a port to supply an invasion. So, the Germans turned every major port, Cherbourg, Le Havre, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, into a Festung, fortress. They fortified them so heavily that they became almost impossible to take. This actually influenced the Allied D-Day planning. The Allies realized they couldn't capture a port intact. So, they brought their own ports with them, the Mulberry Harbors. The Germans spent the war preparing to defend the ports, while the Allies prepared to land on the beaches. Saint-Nazaire was the catalyst for this German obsession. It forced the Wehrmacht to adopt a defensive, fortress mentality. They stopped thinking about winning the war and started thinking about how not to lose their conquests. The resources wasted on the Atlantic Wall because of the panic caused by the Commandos were staggering. In a sense, the HMS Campbelltown didn't just blow up a gate, it blew a hole in the German war economy. The raid on Saint-Nazaire is often called the greatest raid of all. It is a title earned by blood. Of the 611 men who entered the Loire estuary that night, 169 were killed and 215 were captured. Only 228 returned to England. The casualty rate was appalling. But the mission was 100% successful. The dry dock at Saint-Nazaire remained useless for the rest of the war. The battleship Tirpitz never dared to venture into the Atlantic. It spent the war hiding in Norwegian fjords until it was eventually sunk by RAF bombers. The lives saved by keeping the Tirpitz in check, the thousands of merchant sailors who survived because the convoys weren't attacked by a battleship, cannot be counted. The bravery of the raiders was recognized with the awarding of 5 Victoria Crosses, the highest military decoration in the British Empire. This was more VCs than any other single action of its size in the war. Among them was Commander Beatty, who steered the ship, and Lieutenant Colonel Newman, who led the fight ashore. Sergeant Durrant, manning a Lewis gun on the deck of a burning motor launch, fought off a German warship until he died of his wounds. A German officer who witnessed his bravery reportedly recommended him for the VC to the British prisoners. Even the enemy was awed by their courage. Today, Saint-Nazaire is a bustling port again. The dry dock has been repaired. The massive gate has been replaced. But if you walk along the dockside, there is a memorial. It faces the sea, looking out toward the estuary where the Campbell town made her final run. The legacy of the raid is the triumph of the underdog. It proved that imagination and courage can overcome superior firepower. The German officers had laughed at the British army. They had dismissed the Commandos. But on a dark night in March 1942, the laughter stopped. The Commandos proved that Fortress Europe had a glass jaw. And they punched it. The raid remains a masterclass in special operations warfare, studied by military academies around the world. It stands as a testament to the men who volunteered for a suicide mission, not for glory, but because they knew it had to be done. They sailed into the lion's den, twisted the lion's tail, and burned his house down.